On the street, New Yorkers looked up and watched in horror.
Para o mundo, a queda de um símbolo do poderio americano, o início de uma nova era de incertezas. Para os nova-iorquinos, uma dor que os anos não apagam, uma cadeira vazia na mesa de jantar. Nova York foi a maior vítima dos atentados de 11 de setembro. Quase 3 mil mortos, 10 mil feridos e milhões de vidas despedaçadas. Você vai conhecer neste Globo News Especial 4 personagens de Nova York. Histórias de perda, dor e recomeço. Fomos até Long Island, onde fica a única clínica especializada em atender os primeiros a chegar ao World Trade Center. O Dr. Benjamin Luft era pesquisador da universidade da região, onde mora mais da metade dos bombeiros e policiais de Nova York, e criou o centro de atendimento movido pela experiência daquele dia. O senhor contou que no dia dos atentados, os médicos ficaram esperando pelos pacientes e eles simplesmente não apareceram. Até que o senhor mesmo decidiu ir no Marco Zero e acabou percebendo que precisava cuidar deles de uma outra maneira.
The feeling that one has, as a physician, you're waiting for people, you want to save them, you want to help them, and then they don't come. It's a tremendous emptiness, and almost a depression that overcame everyone, because I think we all felt what the meaning of all that was. And we saw pictures on the television and heard reports on the radio, but it all seemed to be very unreal until I actually went down there and saw the magnitude of the problem and the intensity of the problem. And at that moment I realized that this was going to be far greater than just the collapse of those buildings.
À medida em que atendia os pacientes, o Dr. Benjamin percebeu que os bombeiros e policiais do 11 de setembro não precisavam cuidar apenas do corpo. A ferida na alma desses homens e mulheres era muito mais profunda do que qualquer doença que eles pudessem apresentar. Foi então que ele decidiu montar este estúdio improvisado no próprio escritório dele e começou a gravar os relatos. As histórias acabaram se transformando no maior arquivo de depoimentos sobre aquele dia e mostram o impacto real que os atentados tiveram sobre a vida de pessoas comuns, muito além das estatísticas.
We weren't there to get paid. We weren't interested in making a buck on this. We were interested in trying to help save lives.
People from all over this country, not just New York. 435 congressional districts in the United States, 431 of them came to Ground Zero. The good came to fight that evil.
And what we realized was that this was not really the story of the responders. This was not what they were all about. This was not, it wasn't a discussion of their motivation, or why they went down there, what brought them there. Why did they put themselves into harm's way? And we thought that was a very important story to tell.
As we were walking in, we could see firemen and other cops walking out, and I'll never forget the look on their faces. It was like nothing, like hollow souls.
When someone is in the midst of a disaster and the world seems to be crumbling around them, literally, one has to find meaning in order, as an antidote to despair. And very often that meaning comes from being able to do something for someone else, for some greater purpose. And so what you hear over and over again from the responders is that the person that they were rescuing gave them that meaning. And that's what gave them that capacity to carry through, to follow through, and to survive.
I think I did my best. You know, I really, I had a chance to leave, and I chose to stay.
We offered to go in immediately, and they needed iron workers desperately.
I think one of the things that I was impacted by was that these were stories by everyday people, by people you see in the street working, construction workers, laborers, policemen, firemen, people who you think do blue-collar work. But the complexity of their thought, the depth of their thought, was really remarkable. They understood the complexity and the contradictions that were occurring. So there were people who talked to me about religious reawakenings, spiritual issues. There were people, they talked about their deep sense of community, of service. They talked about tolerance. You know, something that you wouldn't hear in the newspapers, how they all worked together, that there was no real thought in terms of people's color or religious persuasion. Never even enters their minds. I had one memorable thought was that a man who was a air conditioner engineer, and he pulled out poetry that moved him. I think, you know, when we talk about a country, we talk about, you know, it's a very complex entity. You have the people, you have the sense of nation and its history, and then you have the government. I think all of them are very proud to be Americans. A tremendous amount of patriotism, tremendous sense of service, almost to an individual. Every one of them has said, if I had to do it all over again, I would do exactly the same. There would be no change as to how they responded and what they did on 9/11 and the time afterwards. I think what they think about their fellow Americans and the support that they got and was, I think that they all appreciated it in a very heartfelt manner. But I think in terms of the government, as far as what their expectations were, I think that they may have been somewhat let down.
You will never get it until you're standing in the middle of that chaos.
Perhaps the most terrifying thing I've ever experienced in my life.
I remember it was my daughter's maybe 4th day at kindergarten, and I remember thinking, oh, this is going to be a great day, because it was the first day that she didn't sob crying when I left her, when I dropped her off at school. So she started off really great, and I went to work that morning. I work as a nurse practitioner in a very large public high school in New York City, and I work in a clinic there, and that's where I was on September 11th. I was on the phone with a nurse who worked in East Harlem. We were talking about a patient, and she said to me, "Did you hear that a plane just hit the World Trade Center?" And I said, "No, that sounds awful." And she said, "Yeah, there's news reports just coming out." So we agreed to get off the phone, that there's too much happening, and we would talk about this patient later. I didn't know my brother was there at that time. He didn't work there. So it wasn't until a little after 11 that my one sister called me and told me that Bill, in fact, had been at a breakfast conference and was at the World Trade Center on that day. I left work after I found out about my brother, and I went, my daughter went to school about 3 blocks away, and I went and picked up my daughter. I called my husband, and no, actually I picked up my 3 kids. They were all in the same school, and went home, and we did not watch anything on TV. I had 3 small children at that point. They were 5, 7, and 9, and I didn't want them seeing what was happening. About midnight, a friend, I now have a son with a broken leg. We're back at the house, and about midnight I went with another dear friend of mine, and we took the 4 train as far as we could into Grand Central Station, and then walked around the city from hospital to hospital, like many, many families that night, going from door to door just to try to find out about survivors. And I know that night it became very apparent to me that Bill had been killed. There were no survivors. In every emergency room we went to, it was fairly clear that, no, I'm sorry, you know, we don't have anyone who was actually inside the towers. Initially, it just, no, it was just enormous sorrow. You know, my brother was killed. And I think, you know, my family was just engulfed in grief. And I didn't feel angry at that point in time. I mean, it was impossible to figure out who to be angry at. The people who hijacked the planes died also. It wasn't known immediately how this all came about. It's 10 years later now. We understand a lot more about that day.
Ainda em 2001, Colleen Kelly conheceu outras pessoas com histórias parecidas com a dela. Juntos, criaram a organização Peaceful Tomorrows para dar voz aos parentes das vítimas. Para isso, foram conhecer de perto os inimigos da América.
4 family members then traveled to Afghanistan in January to meet with Afghan families who had been affected by the bombing campaign there. The Iraqis that I met with, and we went to schools, we went to hospitals, we went to government agencies, we met with Tariq Aziz, and very, very forthrightly confronted him about the human rights abuses of the Hussein regime, but also expressed our concern about what would happen if a war happened. But most Iraqis were very well educated and very knowledgeable about not only current events, what had happened, but also there was a sense that the war was happening, and I kind of got the feeling that people were hunkering down. What amazed me about that trip was I was trying to think of how I would feel if I had to trade places with an Iraqi civilian, and how would I feel if Americans were coming to visit my country knowing that the leaders of that country might be waging a war very shortly. And I experienced really nothing but kindness. Grief gets used in many, many, many ways. I think looking back over the past 10 years that I was very naive 10 years ago. And part of me wants to regain that naivete and another part does not. But I felt like the emotions and what was happening in 2001 and 2002 was so real and so honest and so truthful that there was a real beauty in that. Then that grief did start to get manipulated. And I think 9/11 families, I'll speak for myself, I think I began to think a lot about how grief can be used for positive good and how grief can be used for negative violence. And so I wanted my grief to be used for actions for peace. And that's kind of the motto of Peaceful Tomorrows, is using and turning grief into action for peace. Because the instinct for revenge and the instinct to retaliate is very real. And I'm not saying I've never felt that. I certainly have felt that. But justice more strongly, I wanted justice more than anything else.
Well, me and my friend, this is our first day of high school, I believe. And we were just hanging out in the street, getting ready to go to class. And overhead we heard these 2 airplanes. No, we heard the first airplane flying really, really low. And this was unusual because there aren't any airports very close to here, so we were thinking, okay, that's kind of strange. And the engine sounded a little bit weird as well, as if they were stressed or something. And the sound kind of faded away, and we heard something strange far off in the distance. We didn't make much of it, and we went to class. 10 minutes later, everyone started freaking out. People started freaking out. You know, everyone was just calling each other. Everyone who had cell phones at the time started calling everyone, but they couldn't because the communications were all down. We had a very old TV in the classroom. We turned it on, very fuzzy, bad image, and that's where we saw it.
And was the TV on when the second plane crashed?
I think this might have been after both of them had already hit.
Okay.
And we just saw the smoke and everything, and we didn't really stay in the classroom long enough to see the collapse or anything. but because we were quickly shepherded into the church across the street, which was big enough to hold everyone in the school. And basically there they told us what was going on, and they told us basically, you know, your parents are going to come pick you up now, and you know, try to keep us calm.
But then your parents couldn't come, and then you decided by yourself to go home.
Yeah,
You
my
didn't
parents
talk to
couldn't
your
come.
parents.
My parents couldn't come. Actually, I started walking with my sister, and a friend of my mom's came and met with us, and then walked us the rest of the way. Because my mom worked in an ER, so she couldn't leave. So basically, then we walked all about 100 blocks to home.
You were starting your high school, and then that's when you start to think about growing up, go to college, everything. How did it change your perspective about your life?
At the time, I was very young and impressionable. I was very shocked, and I had a lot of hate and a lot of anger at the people who did this. But then I started realizing that, oh, maybe America brought this upon itself. And so for a couple of years, I was very, very liberal, almost extremely liberal. I went to a lot of anti-war protests. I had my hair very long and everything. You know, this young teenager kind of thing.
But what was the impact to your generation, you think?
To my generation was, we grew up when America was extremely affluent. We grew up during the 90s when the tech boom and everything was awesome, you know. We had a budget surplus, things were going really good. And this was kind of like the beginning of the hard times, economically and politically. Especially for a lot of people here in New York, all my friends were very liberal, very, you know, well-off people. It became difficult for us financially, but then mostly because of the Bush years. That was why one reason I went to Canada for university, because I wanted to get out of America. America became extremely reactionary and extremely right-wing, and nobody liked it.
A poucos passos do Marco Zero, um memorial atrai milhares de turistas todos os anos. Mas pouca gente conhece a história de amor entre pai e filho por trás deste tributo. O fundador deste pequeno museu serviu ao Corpo de Bombeiros de Nova York durante 26 anos. Na manhã de 11 de setembro de 2001, o filho dele recebeu um chamado de emergência para o World Trade Center. Jonathan foi um dos 343 bombeiros que morreram naquele dia. O pai dele cavou com as próprias mãos e não descansou enquanto não retirou o corpo do filho do meio dos escombros.
You know, I turned the TV on right away. I saw what everybody saw. People were saying maybe a small plane. Jonathan said the same thing. He said, that's not a small plane, that's a big plane. I said, are you going? He said, I don't know. I called, meaning he called the dispatcher to... In the background you could hear a tone, which means they were going out on a run. And he said, Dad, we're going to the World Trade Center. I said, okay, John, be careful. That's the last time I spoke to my son. My mission was to come into the city and try to help, even though I was retired, thinking I could stay up on the side someplace and help. But just as I was leaving my house with my son, Brendan, who was a New York City firefighter, also, the second plane struck. So that was it. I knew right away it was a terrorist attack of some kind. So I still came in. Brendan went to his firehouse. My mission was going to be still to try and help on the side. But then my mission turned into trying to find my son, Jonathan. So I did stay at the site for 9 months in recovery work. It took 3 months to find Jonathan, to the day. It was December 11th. And I had left the site. You know, one part of me, I wanted to be there. So I was home. I got a phone call about 11:30. Good friend, chief in charge of the site for the night. And all he said was, Lee, we have John. I said, okay, I'll be right in. So I got my son Brendan, and Brendan and I came in. And in our tradition of the fire department, it might be in Brazil also, I don't know, but if a company loses a man at a fire, that company takes the man out. You know, no matter who finds him, they just leave them there till the company comes. So my son Brendan and I, and some of the men from my son's company, were able to carry Jonathan out, bring him home. For me to stand here and say I wasn't angry, I didn't have hatred, especially that day and the immediate days following, I would be lying to you. But my day was consumed. I was working all the time, you know, and when I wasn't here, I was asleep because it was tiring.
Your son had two sons. How are they doing today?
You know, people have asked me that. Every time we speak, people ask that question. How are they doing? How are all of these people that we see here, how are their parents doing? How are their children doing? When you lose a loved one, any place, you may be able to go a month or 2 months before you remember, especially after time passes, where you're reminded about the death of it. Here, there is no getting away from 9/11. It's every single day of the week, every day. So the young people especially, as they're growing without their dad or mom, they'll read the newspapers for school. They'll have to watch some of the programs on TV for school, the computer, so you don't have rest. You're reminded about your loss every day, every day. So it's very, very difficult for all of these people to this day. And the news doesn't have to be bad news. It could be good news. They could talk about Bin Laden, that we finally got them. They talk about the memorial, good things that are happening. But every time you say 9/11, those people remember one thing. My children, my family remember Jonathan. And the pain is back there again from that day. So, but we can't forget it. I think we have to keep it in the forefront. In the fire service, and I know in Brazil it's the same thing. When you raise your right hand to be sworn in as a firefighter, there's only one mission in the fire service, and that's you, the people, right? So if there's a fire in your house, there's only one place for us to go, and that's in to help you, or to get you, or your family, save your belongings. So 9/11 showed that to the world, you know. 9/11, we lost 23 New York City police officers, 37 Port Authority police officers. Now, their missions were different. The fire department, New York City Fire Department, lost 343 very brave men. Their only mission that day was to go up the stairs to help those people. That is their mission, just like I said. So it sent a beautiful message around the world that this is what firemen do, whatever country you're in. Whatever country you're in, even if Afghanistan or Iraq or Iran, if there's a fire, those men are trained to come and help you. So it sent a beautiful message.
I don't know what it is. They say someone needs help.
Yeah, Mike! Mike! Mike, come over here! Yeah!
Anybody need a doctor?
Where are you?
Don't have oxygen.
Hey!
It's too unsafe to go in there.